Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. Strange presenter trying their best to talk about, a different album each and every week, right? So in today's episode, we have, we're returning once again to the randomizer, which has kicked out a very peculiar and interesting suggestion, I have to say the least. And so this suggestion comes from longtime channel supporter Max Wethersfield, who has submitted the music of Max Wethersfield. Brilliant stuff. So this suggestion didn't come with a particular album. So I've had to just, I've taken the liberty of picking one of my absolute favourites from the one and only Max Wethersfield. So let's dive into it, why not, shall we? Today I present the EP of Everything on It by Max Wethersfield. So, let's of course ask ourselves the question, who is Max Wethersfield? Well, Max Wethersfield is the moniker for one Robert Eric Dodson, experimental drone musician hailing from Los Angeles, California. And so Eric runs the wonderful channel Max Wethersfield, of course, a channel that's been around for a little over 6 years, it seems, offering up experimental dirges and countless albums, all falling under the experimental noise, drone and ambient labels. It's an incredibly extensive and chunky channel that mixes up live improvisational performances utilizing, a wide number of wonderful pedal effects, alongside various album releases, mostly improvised on the app GarageBand, from my understanding of what Eric has told me. And so, whilst none of these albums are available to purchase physically or even download off of the website, they are all available to listen to for free through the Max Wethersfield channel, of course. And so I'll say here, as a result of there being no actual tangible release of this apart from the videos themselves on the channel, I took the liberty of designing a mock-up vinyl release for it just to showcase, just to have something to show during this video. Very silly, very pointless, but I thought it'd be kind of cool. So, getting back to it, today we are reviewing probably one of my favourite albums from the Max Wethersfield channel, Everything on It. And I'll say, when Eric requested, many moons ago, his own music for inclusion on the show, I had no idea where to start with this extensive discography, to be fair. There's so much out there that picking just one thing is merely scratching upon the surface of it all, barely glimpsing at the true range of everything being presented here. And it's one of the most impressive things I find about Eric's music, truth be told. There is so much of it, such a wide variety of different things, and it all just culminates into somebody who just loves expressing themselves through music, it feels. Regardless of it all though, Everything on It was one of the first albums I heard, and one of the ones I kept returning to as well. A somewhat short little EP release within this large discography that I would say is arguably a good launching off point for the world of Max Wethersfield. So let's dive into it, shall we? So Everything on It, the album opens up with the 11-minute dirge of Delicious Again. And from the immediate onset, you're given such fuzzy effects-laden guitars, backed up by slow, rhythmic, percussive beats that feel like more strung-out versions of the kinds of things you might hear on Pentastar in the style of Demons by Earth. Even the guitar has that kind of noisy effect as well, with that distortion just resonating and ringing out so satisfyingly as it just fills up the space with this electronic noise. And what I really love about the composition is just this free-form approach to just the whole composition itself, to all the different layers of music. although it was composed through GarageBand, composed through simple clicking of buttons, essentially. Like I used to compose music through the iPad on GarageBand, and then do a lot of similar things. But even so, when you listen to this, you can kind of just imagine Max Wethersfield there with his guitars, just playing to his heart's content, playing whatever he wants because it's fun to do so, right? I think it's very fun, and this whole track as well, it's a wonderful introduction to this whole world of Max Wethersfield, of just noise, of dirge, of drone, of ambient and rock, and all these great bands that, from the drone scene, and all facets of the drone scene, it feels. I love how chunky the whole thing is though as well though. Like there's a lovely slow build up with that monolithic tempo, that descends on some really chewy guitar parts, I have to say, before it falls away into a sort of dissonance as it's almost like, the effects are trying to interpret the signal before it being called back into the scene with the ringing of the guitar's chords. I like how towards the end though, those weird droning dissonant parts, it seems to pull the scenery up entirely though, dragging the composition into these really peculiar moments that haven't at all been suggested by the rest of the composition, if that makes sense. Especially when the whole thing just ends on this incredibly absurd crash into a wall, as everything just falls into a million pieces. I think it genuinely might be one of my favourite things I've come across from Max Wethersfield though, since being introduced to his music back in the early days of weird music, I have to say. This was always one that stood out for me. There's tons of great albums, great songs, great live improvisations, etc., from Wethersfield, but this one holds a special place in my heart, I feel, a kind of dirgy electronic exploration across the vast open desert as nighttime slowly descends upon the entire landscape. Such a fantastic vibe, and so reminiscent of the likes of Earth, as I have mentioned, especially in terms of an approach to the guitar itself, it feels, and the multitude of wonderful sounds and expressions one can pull from it, just by, essentially making sounds that sound like it, I guess, through the iPad, I suppose. Or through GarageBand, depending on however you use the app, essentially. Of course, there's a lot more to this album, though. Following on from the opening track, we get a bit of a shorter dirge with the track No Longer a Place for Ribs. And so immediately we realise we're in for a bit of a different vibe here. You're getting sparse notes, the ringing and pinging of delay effects, it feels, creating an almost alien atmosphere of sorts. And it's a few moments before we're then introduced to this little acoustic riff of sorts, giving the whole thing this oddly pleasant vibe, but one that is shrouded in this odd murky darkness of sorts. And it's as though the landscape is slowly shifting before our very eyes, as aliens descend from the skies above to abduct the unsuspecting wanderers of the desert. And what I like is how after the atmosphere of this track has been presented to us, those incredibly weird pings and warps of guitar notes just start to inhabit the scene, suggesting to the oddities lurking ahead. And I like how sort of concisely this track presents in this incredibly strange, unusual mood, which becomes more weirder the more you progress through it. And so here on the actual video for the album itself, we're given a little bit of an interlude of sorts, or an introacte, as is mentioned in the video. Not a word I've come across for, but there's a first time for everything. And so in my weird little narrative that in my head that I'm creating for this is perhaps purposely placed here, maybe to mimic the effect of either flipping over the vinyl record or even a cassette, hence the weird faux design created for this very video. And to be fair, Eric has split up the album into two parts though, with Delicious Again and No Longer a Place for Rib occupying that first part, or side A, and side B consisting of the last two tracks. So with the interlude over, let's discuss it, shall we? And so this is where it feels like Max Wethersfield is starting to have a lot more fun, as though he wasn't already on the rest of this album. Don't get me wrong, it just seems like this is where the creativity just really indulges in just how fun it is to compose music, essentially. And so part 2 opens up with Matching Pajamas, an incredibly disorientating and confusing track that feels like we're now on board the alien vessel itself, slowly slipping in and out of consciousness, catching the briefest glimmers of the strange vessel and trying our best to comprehend it all as it barely makes any sense anyway. And musically, it feels like Eric has composed an unusual little droning track here, and painstakingly edited to just start and stop intermittently, creating that incredibly confusing atmosphere, I think. And before long, it becomes accompanied by a sort of backing drone, of course, one shrouded in interference that feels like it's struggling to really express itself once again. And it's a confusing opening, of course, but there's something weirdly delightful about it all that makes it just fun to listen to. And what I love is, the more this one progresses, the stranger it all becomes once again. You end up having the most unusual of worlds where you get bombarded with dense, heavy tones, arrhythmic drum patterns it feels, and a swirling miasma of electronics as machinery just rings in our very heads, performing their invasive autopsies. I find this one to be a bit of a sonic overload at times, but there's something delightful as to the incredibly strange atmosphere that the whole thing provides. And one considers how this very album started and how through experimentation and improvisation, we've ended up here somehow, where this weird assortment of sounds has become the very world that we now must comprehend as a result. But it's weirdly brilliant, I feel, though. It's strange to hear, but it works very well in the context of the whole album, I feel. And so, from here we get to the album's final track. No, It's a Hologram, parts 1 to 3. And so if we thought the previous tracks were strange, this one is on a whole nother level in my opinion, dominated at first by this very, kind of basic yet wonderful little bass riff, We're then accompanied by this screaming of electronic guitar sounds just noodling away once again. Perhaps almost harkening back to the sounds heard on the album's very first track. Though after everything we've been through, it doesn't feel as warm and fuzzy as it as it started off doing so, and instead we can only play the most painful of dissonant, ringing electronic distortion it feels. What I like though is how when the drums come in on this one, they play this ferocious pounding rhythm as Max Wethersfield once again noodles away to their heart's content. There's such a menacing and dark vibe to this one, perhaps as though our comprehension of the very events we've undergone has led us to a place of, maybe anger and malice towards the very experience, perhaps. But of course, with this song being in 3 parts, we end up experiencing a little unusual pause where all that anger and ferocity seems to fall away, leaving the landscape clear for more experimental dirges of delay effects, sustain effects, and anything that just pulls the notes out ad nauseum into the infinitesimal. And I love how spacey and strung out this section is, just creating this moment where it feels like we're spinning completely out of control, falling back into the recesses of our own head. And it creates such a dizzying, confusing quality to it, but there's something fantastic about it, especially in the sort of semi-quasi narrative that your head ends up inventing when you hear this album. But of course, there is one final moment on this album, part 3, where we get what is arguably one of the strangest parts of this entire album. A strange little plucked riff of sorts as the bass pushes along the whole thing, backed up by an unusual beat of sorts. And it's an unusual way to end off this whole album experience, especially with the intermittent swells and noise and distortion. But after everything we've experienced, it all feels oddly fitting, as though we're no longer comprehending the strangeness of it all anyway, and that we have to just kind of continue on with our lives, do the best we can, and maybe just try and get over the fact that we've experienced an incredibly existential experience that will most likely never be properly explained. And so essentially with that, we even covered the entirety of the album, everything on it, Max Wethersfield. Such an unusual and strange album, I feel, and it's one that's perhaps a little bit disingenuous to Eric's output, but considering how prolific the channel is for producing music for, of many different kinds, and just how much the man experiments with so many different facets of the guitar, and other instruments, of course, both in terms of live improvisation and, composition on GarageBand and stuff. it makes me think that perhaps there's no best place to start, if that makes sense, and that any starting point, is going to be incredibly strange and weird in its own right. But the thing is, it's stuff like that I find truly delightful when it comes to experimental artists, a sense that you never know exactly what you're going to get yourself in for when it comes to, any of the music you hear, but you know for damn sure that it's going to be a very kind of weird experience in its own right. And I have to say, everything that I have heard from Max Wethersfield, which isn't everything, I must admit, but everything I have heard is so incredibly satisfying for its own reasons, one way or another. And at the core of it all is what makes the whole thing truly special. A cool dude exploring their creativity by noodling around on instruments and composing cool stuff, basically. And so, before we close off, we're actually incredibly fortunate to have a little bit more insight into the world of Max Wethersfield and this particular album in question. And so, in preparation for this one, I reached out to Max Wethersfield for a little bit of help in providing some resources for the album, but also providing a lot more context for this one as well. And so I'm incredibly grateful to Eric for having answered my incredibly inane questions, I have to say. It's provided a lot of context for both the project of Max Wethersfield and this album that I really didn't know anything about. So let's crack on with it, shall we? How long have you been making and producing music for? I've been playing on and off since the mid-80s. However, I don't sound like it. Out of all your many releases, which one are you most pleased with? Mary Lou. When it comes to everything on it, is there a story or narrative that goes alongside with it? What comes to mind when you hear it? Any interesting and or funny stories you remember from recording this album? No story really, just a collection of songs. Most of the humour comes from the titles. Delicious Again comes from a line in the Beastie Boys' The Blue Nun. No Longer a Place for Ribs is about a restaurant that closed down called Tony Roma's, whose tagline was a place for ribs. Hence, they are no longer a place for ribs. Matching Pajamas was about those family Christmas photos you've probably seen where the entire family is wearing the same pajamas. And No, It's a Hologram is about a funny story from a deceased relative who was being sarcastic when asked a question about what he was eating. Is that your steak? No, it's a hologram. From my understanding, you're a musician who gets a hell of a lot out of their pedals. Do you have any that are your favourites and most like to use? I love my fuzz pedals for the grit and sustain, and my delay pedals because delay sounds cool. What instruments and pedals we use for everything on it, memory permitting? I didn't use any, I don't think. I used a lot of the effects that are in GarageBand, and I tend to use effects more for my performances videos, what I would sound like live. When it comes to your videos, you seem to just follow your own improvisational muse when composing music. How would you describe the process of creating music for the Max Wethersfield channel, and what's the process involved? For performance videos, I typically set up my camera phone and simply improvise. For my album's recorded material, I go into GarageBand, hit record, and let my imagination take over. For the images I use, I just record whatever images I find out in the public and use those. An obvious question, but who would be the main influences for the type of music you create? Sono, Portishead, Earth, My Disco, Nick Drake, The Beatles, mid-60s through early 70s Beach Boys, Gheorghe Ligeti, Pink Floyd, Nirvana, AMM, and anything dissonant and atonal. What is it about experimental drone rock that draws you to the genre? The unpredictability. With pop music, there are certain rules, and with experimental music, you have less restrictions. Any favourite albums of all time you'd like to shout out? Paul's Boutique, Beastie Boys. Earth 2, Earth. Monolith and Dimensions, Sun. Revolver and Abbey Road, The Beatles. South of Heaven and Seasons in the Abyss, Slayer. Kid A, Radiohead, Meddle, Pink Floyd, Fair Warning, Van Halen, and anything John Williams did for Star Wars. And so firstly, a huge thanks to Robert Eric Dodson for the little interview. A bunch of comments. I have to say, I'm very much amused at how completely off my interpretation of this particular album has been. But I think that's actually a joy when it comes to abstract music of sorts, you know. Your own mind ends up just conjuring up its own images and narratives, pulling it out of nowhere, it seems, you know, influenced by the very music itself, of course. And the contrast and all the different variations of interpretation, as well as the actual story of the actual album story behind the album, it's kind of cool to me, I have to say. Also, I mentioned about the GarageBand thing in the review, but I did not find out until Eric sent over the answers to this, and I had to say, I was very surprised indeed. A weirdly fun app, to say the least, and it was also the genesis for some of the very first drone albums I ever tried to make, and essentially my first foray into improvisational creativity, I feel. As well as that, though, I have to say, I really do appreciate, just the kind of work that Eric does for the Max Wethersfield channel. Like, there's something so cool about just loving music because of how cool it is to play music, essentially. And, Eric just noodling away on his guitars, just because pedal effects sound cool, delay effects sound cool. Like, these are all my favourite pedals as well, to be fair, actually. And it's always something I've really admired in the music of Eric. And I have to say, really grateful to have so much more context for the entire ethos of the channel. So a huge thank you once again. And so with that, I think we're going to come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Weird album to have looked into, considering that there's no official release for it all, but irrelevant perhaps. In any case, I'm glad to have gotten the word out about Max's wonderful music, though. It took an incredibly long time to get the thoughts out about this one, but we got there eventually, and I do hope I've done the album some justice, I hope. Once again, huge thanks to Robert Eric Dodson for their involvement in this episode, there is a link to both the album we've looked at today, as well as to his YouTube channel, so by all means, go show the dude your support. With that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. At the end of every month, we always try to do a randomized episode from your suggestions, so feel free to add things to the randomizer if you would like to. As for that, I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.